Wolfgang, what has gone wrong?
Its reliance on China for exports is also looking increasingly dodgy. Virtually all the areas they had some competitiveness issues, but not sort of a product problem. Today they have a product problem because they have not kept a pace with the digital revolution. Germany is clearly not a leader in anything to do with high tech. It doesn't have any high tech company.
Is there a plan to fix it?
No.
Hello, my name is Justin Stairs. This is the Brussels Signal Studio, and we're online today with Wolfgang Münchau, who many of our English-speaking viewers will know from his time at the Financial Times, also a New Statesman columnist. He is a UK-based journalist, though German-born. Hello, Wolfgang.
Hello, good morning, and thank you for having me on your show.
No, we are very grateful to have you here. Now, Wolfgang has just had a book published. It's called Kaput, The End of the German Miracle. Now, this is a story that we've been following here on the Brussels Signal, in particular the trials and tribulations of the car manufacturing industry, but not only. So my first question, Wolfgang, what has gone wrong in Germany?
Yeah, what went wrong is apparent only sort of more recently. The German economy, still gave reasonably strong economic performance figures until not many years ago. But the mistakes or the policy errors that led to what the sad situation in which Germany finds itself today started a long time ago. My book basically makes the unfashionable case that it is more to do with technology, with the way finance is oriented, with the way capital is allocated, with the way the whole system is, the whole philosophy of the system. This is highly based on industry, not just industry, but industrial exports, and not just exports, but also industrial export surpluses. It is that model that has worked extremely well until it didn't. It's sort of a model that is, it can be successful at times when the confluences of the world, like geopolitics and globalization and certain technical changes like supply chain revolutions, when they all aligned perfectly, the system performed really well. But the system was not so sustainable because all of these factors changed. The supply chain revolution happened. We've had supply chain shocks. We no longer optimize our supply chains. We make them more robust. Geopolitics has turned in a completely different directions, where Germany's reliance on Russia is no longer a feasible business option, and Germany's reliance on China for exports is also looking increasingly dodgy because it is subject to geopolitical disturbances in the future. And the other thing that has changed is technology. 20 years ago, when the German economy was considered to be the sick man of Europe, as people called it, back in those days, it was very much a situation in which Germany was still leading the world in technology. Its industries were cutting edge in virtually all the areas. They had some competitiveness issues, but not sort of a product problem. Today they have a product problem because they have not kept a pace with the digital revolution. Germany is clearly not a leader in anything to do with high tech. It doesn't have any high-tech companies. The last digital company in Germany is from the early 1970s. And the average age of the DAX 40 companies is about 160 years. It's a country that has gotten stuck in 20th century technology. It's optimized those technologies. It's been very good. It's hard to beat a German car in terms of its a fuel-driven car, I have to say, in terms of its engineering excellence. But the fuel-driven car is not the future. And the Germans have not made the investment into e-cars. They are certainly not made the investments into software, and that is where they're lagging behind. And this is not something that government policy can easily fix. If the whole
well, that's interesting. I mean, this is, you talk about neo-Luddism in your book, and this is what you're referring to now, which is a reluctance to adopt the latest technology. Well, where does that come from?
It That's a very good question. Why is a country that was sort of at the technological edge pretty much throughout most of the industrial revolution, since the start of the industrial revolution, why they have sort of become Luddites? You would have thought the Germans would be the last people to actually, enter this period. And I think it was something to do with a misjudgment. Germany didn't think the digital revolution was mattered when it happened. It wasn't it was not, it was sort of seen as very much like toys. The Germans made proper heavy earth moving equipment, and then you had mobile phones and entertainment devices and karaoke machines, and that was basically not taken very seriously. And they felt that the car was basically so perfect that nothing else could replace it. So there was arrogance. There was a general lack of understanding of digital technology and what it would do to our lives. They misjudged this, and a general skepticism of technologies that were not made by us. That's essentially this.
But
Someone
in
else.
fact, this has reached almost ridiculous heights, according to what you've written. I mean, even the fax machine, I understand, has been still widely used right up until this year. One of the reporters here in the newsroom said that most Germans still file their taxes via fax. I don't know if that's true, but
That is true. The public
w-
sector still uses the fax machine. Doctors' offices still use the fax machine. The army still uses the fax machine, and it's widely used in the country. It's ridiculous, absolutely ridiculous. They will always say, "Yeah, but it's legally. It's the only way signatures count." But other countries figured that one out by allowing digital signatures and by allowing and treating emails as proper legal form of communications. So you don't need a fax machine in order to deliver something that is legally watertight. But that's sort of the excuse. There's an awful lot of excuses about this, and then there's an awful lot of sort of pseudoscience behind this. I mean, there is there is a huge movement in Germany to stop any digitalization of schools. One of the I quoted one of the most successful books in Germany in the last 10, 15 years has been by an author who has been warning against digitalization of schools. It's not about mobile phones in class. This is not about that. It's about should children be taught computing, and should there be any computers in school? Should there be any digital devices in school? And there is a broad consensus in Germany that there shouldn't. And it's sort of if you wanted to if you are digitally illiterate, then you now pass on your digital illiteracy to the next generation, and they may just be their exposure to this. They still do TikTok as all the kids do, but they're not actually, they're not the tech entrepreneurs of the next generation either. So this is sort of a problem that has persisted. Many companies are not connected to the internet. They don't have fiber optical cables. Mobile phone networks are very poor in Germany. It's actually one of the worst in the whole of the EU. This is one of the richest countries in the EU, and yet they cannot. They have underinvested in this, and there were other factors that came together. The German debt break, which curtailed public investment, and that was the thing that fell off the cliff. So the country kind of got stuck in the analog world, which is sort of a world that people use cash when they go to shops, and this is something become very symptomatic, and that's going to be very hard to fix.
is there a plan to fix it? I mean, do they now, the German policymakers now realize it was a mistake?
No, they basically have I would characterize the German political debate as between competing versions of how to make the 20th century successful. This is the left. There's a left version of a 20th century industrial economy. That means we need to invest into the car industry. We need to save factories. We need to save jobs. And then there's the right version, which is yes, we need to make the car companies competitive by cutting wages, by having more brutalist type of social policies. But ultimately, it's all about the car industry. It's all about making the car industry more competitive, rather than making yourself less dependent on the car industry, or providing an infrastructure that would allow the car industry to also enter the 21st century by recognizing that the future of car is not in the engine or in some kind of gearbox, but in software. And modern car companies, if you look at what happens in China, the mobile phone makers are starting to encroach into the car industry. Huawei and Xiaomi are car makers these days, and it's unsurprising because they're software people, and the modern car, the next generation of car, is essentially a software product. A service is a software update. It's a different product, and that's why this is not just the same product experience a technological development. This is the change from a car to a digital device. I call the electric car an iPad with wheels, and that's essentially what it is. And the current car makers are not the people who who see this. I was reminded. I made this analogy in the book with Smith Corona. If the older generation will probably remember, Smith Corona was a typewriter, very successful typewriter manufacturer that in the early days of the digital revolution was actually quite good at integrating computers into the typewriters, and they thought that was the answer, having a digital typewriter. And that it was only the innovation of it took the innovation of a laser printer or other types of printers that kind of blew that out of the water. And this is where the German car industry is, and it will still Germany will still make cars, I'm sure, but they will not employ like 1 million people in it anymore. This will be it will be a smaller, much smaller industry, and this is something
And
for
then
which.
another
Yeah.
another policy mistake that you focus on is this so-called neo-mercantilism. Can you talk a bit about that? Of foreign
Yeah,
policy mistakes of compounding.
behind all this stands a broader ideology, and the broader ideology is a sort of a chain of arguments. Is we are an industrial economy, which is true. There is certainly an expertise made in Germany. It stands for high quality products. But the mistake was that we need to make we need to make export surpluses. Even exporting there's nothing wrong with exporting for as long as you're importing. But Germany made export surpluses. The German system was based on an imbalance. The German media celebrated the imbalance by writing articles as, "Oh, wow, Germany is the export world champion again." Now, being the export world champion is a meaningless economic category. We measure our economic well-being in terms of welfare, in terms of income, in terms of assets, however you measure it, but you don't measure it in terms of sort of pseudo metrics like, oh, we are the world's largest exporter. That's basically a celebration of an imbalance, because what it means, it makes you dependent. Germany became dependent on Russia. Germany's dependent on China. Germany's actually now dependent on the United States because the United States is our biggest market. These dependency have huge political consequences. It's not a good thing to be dependent on others. It is much better to have a more balanced approach. That means others are as dependent on you as you are on them. And this is the neo-mercantilism, the old mercantilists of the French mercantilists of the 17th century. They also sought export surpluses for the purpose of amassing gold to the state. The German version is different. Obviously, it's no longer about gold. The German version is about amassing large profits to the corporations, which themselves then reinvesting those profits abroad into furthering the system. So there are supply chains in China and East European countries that are invested in by German companies, that double down on the same technology. So if VW made profits, it invested those profits into car companies in China or car component makers, that then feed back into the system. If the system breaks, and this is what you call a cluster risk, if the thing goes off the rails, then the whole thing goes off the rails. It's not what would normally happen if you I'd say the British approach is you're becoming more of a rentier, where you say, okay, I'm going to invest in different parts of the world. If I can't beat them, I'll join them and I become an investor. That is an attitude Germans never took. They reinvested into the specializations and doubled down on the risk. It's like a gambler's strategy where you just put everything on one particular number on the board. And that's where the neo mercantilism strategy is ultimately come undone.
And now, of course, we're in a world of tariffs. I presume this is not good news either.
No, no, tariffs are poison because it's another sort of source of vulnerability. I understand why the Americans are doing this. I don't have those sort of gloomy views that some economists have about tariffs. What I I know I've traveled intensely in the United States and I've seen the dereliction caused by outsourcing, and it's a country that has really gotten itself out of industrial manufacturing. It was profitable for the country as a whole, but not for everyone in the country, and people often fail to make the difference between the average person and the median person. The median person in the United States is not as well off as the average person because the average is skewed upwards through very rich people. And we've seen this dereliction, and it's very normal that countries that experience this, that political systems that experience this, that and a median voter would want to correct this. And this is what's happening in the United States. It's actually not the fundamental difference between the Democrats and the Republicans, or between Trump and Biden. It will continue beyond Trump. Trump is a more aggressive proponent of that strategy, but Biden, for example, didn't reverse Trump's tariffs. He imposed on aluminum and steel only for some countries, but for the principle of these tariffs was maintained. He increased the tariffs on China on certain or bans on certain exports to China. Now Trump will go back with even higher tariffs. This is a different thing. But even if a Democrat were to succeed Trump in 2029, I would not expect that policy, whatever Trump does on tariffs, to reverse very much. This is a universal acceptance now in America that trade policy is not what it used to be 20 years ago.
Which I guess is bad news for Europe.
Absolutely. The German car industry will be highly affected because the US is the biggest market for German exports these days, and highly vulnerable. So what will happen is that German car companies will relocate to the United States. This is the logical way to address it, especially since Trump plans two types of tariffs on European products. There's this generic tariff, which will take time. It has to go through Congress. It's a 10%. Sometimes he talked about 20%. The numbers keep changing, but there will be some kind of number, probably 10%, something like that. Generalized tariffs on industrial imports. But then there may well be tariffs he might take under a different under a different trade policy section. A tariff he can impose for, say, national security reasons. He can argue that the German car imports constitute a national security risk. Hard to whether this is something that we in Europe would agree with is another matter. It's not, but it's something that he is allowed to do under U.S. law. And we could easily see a 50-60% tariff on German cars, for example. He can just he can highlight those particular cars, and or he can argue that the German policies, the neo-mercantilism that I was writing about, constitutes an unfair trading practice. He doesn't need our agreement or the WTO's seal of approval to say that. So he can essentially unilaterally decide that. He doesn't even need Congress to approve to agree with him. The courts tend to be very laissez-faire on this and not get involved in the situation. So he can do this. It's the executive power of the president, and if he imposes a 60% say tariff on German cars, it's game over. And then the German car companies will then, they have factories in the United States, so they will relocate or will expand their factories in America to produce locally, and the export and the material will be sourced locally. So the bleeding of the industry will continue. If you just listen to German newspapers right now, every day there's Bosch cutting jobs. There's Mercedes cutting jobs. Obviously, VW is closing 3 factories. Supplier after supplier, they're all cutting because the whole system is geared towards the fuel-driven car. They are not geared up for the electric car. The electric car has fewer parts. It's a simpler device. It's different parts. It's not necessarily they are with the suppliers. The braking systems, for example, are completely different. Work on completely different physical principles. And these markets are different. This is a complete reshuffling of an entire industry. This is not like the same people will do this. Will do the new things. This will be many
And
other people.
To what extent, Wolfgang, is this feeding through from the economic sector to politics? Because we now have elections coming up in Germany, and obviously there's been the rise of the FD, etc. Well, not only the hard right, but the hard left as well. Is this connected with the economic picture?
The way politics responds to periods of economic decline is, we saw this in Italy, and we're seeing a bit of that in the United States. It works against the incumbent. People are just fed up. People say government is not delivering economic welfare for us, so we try the other guy. And that's how Trump got in. That's how Trump got out, and that's how he got back in again. Look at Italy. If you look at the 20 years since Italy's entry into the euro, it's 25 years now. They tried, they have had so many governments, and this is a government. And most governments lasted one term, then they were kicked out. Then they had some various crises and interim prime ministers, but there was never anybody who reigned for longer periods of time. The fact that Angela Merkel was there for 16 years was a reflection that the Germans were relatively happy with their economic system. It delivered during that period, but it stopped delivering towards the end, and now we're sort of in this sort of period of one-term governments. And the Scholz administration has been there for a little over 3 years, and it looks like they're losing the election. One can never predict this. There can always be some upset, but he is trading so far in the polls, and he's been such a people know him, people know his policies. It's not like 3 years ago he was generally unknown, and people thought, oh, maybe he's a good man, a good chancellor, but people have concluded that he's not, and he's not a popular politician. And there will be a change. I don't think it has anything to do with the fact that people like Friedrich Merz particularly. He's the other guy, and he will get a chance. He will get a chance to mess it up again. And he will be in a very similar political constellation as Scholz was. He will have coalition partners. At least one of those coalition partners will be on the left, so that there will all the changes that Merz promised, the undoing of this legislation and that legislation. There's a very unpopular domestic heating bill. There's a very unpopular reform, on corporate social responsibility. Merz will struggle to undo this. He's particularly opposed to the citizens' income, which is sort of a relatively high level of subsistence for people who are not working. This was sort of one of the big sort of legislations of the current administration. It will be very difficult for him to actually make the changes that he promised, because it's always the same kind of coalitions that govern Germany. There are only four parties, centrist parties, and none of them want to work with the extremes. So they only work with each other. So you have, and they together account for like 60-70% of the votes. So, a government, it will take two or three of them to form a coalition. And that means, there is a certain constancy in the policy. And if you have the Greens in the next government, or the Social Democrats in the next government, that will basically mean, they will stand for the continuity because they were the ones, they imposed the policies that Friedrich Merz doesn't like, but he cannot do much about it. So this is ultimately just about management of decline, how you manage this. There isn't, I don't see much, much creative new ideas, and they all still, as I said, it's a competition between, different ways of managing the 20th century. There isn't anyone out there who says, okay, we need to invest in technology. We need to turn us into a player. We need to liberalize the financial sector that can actually deliver the investment on the private sector. Because the banks do not invest into business upstarts. Banks invest into VW and Mercedes. Banks like collateral. They don't take risks, and we told them not to take risks since the global financial crisis. Don't blame the banks; they do what they've been told to do. So you have a system that isn't working anymore. That doesn't deliver change; it delivers continuity. That's what the system does. It doesn't break out. And Germany is worse placed at delivering this, for example, compared even to France. I mean, so the French president is a very powerful figure. The president can change things. The problem that Macron had that he doesn't have a majority, and that's the thing that is the problem. So that's the
I
thing.
I was wondering, Wolfgang, I mean, to what extent, I know that you've written about the euro a lot over the last decade or two, but I'm wondering if the fact that the euro exists actually changes the picture for Germany or other countries, and the fact that they can't devalue as they would have done in the past. Is this a factor, do you think?
Well, the euro. The problem with the euro is the euro has been, as a, in a very narrow sense, successful. It's survived. It's there. But the problem with the euro, it's actually people couldn't devalue. People who were used to devaluing couldn't devalue anymore. Uh, but the real problem with the euro is that it didn't lead to an economic union. The euro project only made, for me, only ever made sense as a step one into a broader economic integration, which is a fiscal union, a capital markets union. That's totally important because it's on everyone's agenda in Brussels. They all talk about this, but it's on nobody's. It's not on the top of anybody's agenda either. So it's and it's a big deal because it requires euro bonds. It requires a whole sort of different way of the way we interact with our banks. We have a lot of money, a lot of financial activity tied up in banks. In bank lending, and this needs to shift towards the capital market. So you need to get to move people's savings into shares rather than deposits. We need to sort of open up a capital market that requires a single safe asset to back it in order to maintain the confidence. It requires sovereignty by the EU. It doesn't have to be a big sovereign federal state. It can be a very small sovereign federal state, but it needs the infrastructure of that, and that is something one would when what I would have what that's actually needed, and it's now that we are falling behind. It's not just Germany. What I'm talking about, Germany is kind of the extreme end of the scale here, but it's many of these problems are very European because other countries are part of German supply chains and so I wouldn't say this is a purely German. France has deep seated economic problems too, and these problems cannot be addressed without an efficient capital market that reallocates private sector investment. We have a lot of savings in Europe. We're not short of that. So we could there's not a lack of money. Basically, it is a matter of how do we organize the how do we get the money to the right people. The EU budget is too small for that. That cannot do that. National budgets do not have a capacity. We're all hitting the limits of our fiscal rules. Yeah, we're not going to do the heavy lifting through The public sector plays a role. It needs to provide infrastructure and education and defense and all these things. That will continue to be important. But the big heavy lifting will have to come from the private sector. Mario Draghi was talking about 5% of GDP every year. That's 800 billion every year. This is real money, not just some classic EU type headline numbers that are sort of ambitions, but actual money. Now this is what it would require. I don't see any German politicians who have that on the top of their lists, and in fact, I don't see anyone in Europe who does either. Most people talk about relatively small matters, and if the priority of the Commission is enlargement, or the Green Deal, or whatever it happens to be, then it tells me this is not going to happen because the Capital Markets Union is a project as big as the euro itself, as big as the single market. These are sort of historic projects that can kind of occupy. If you do this, you know that you're doing it because you will do nothing else for like 5 years. It's not something It's not the number 3 item on a to-do list. Therefore, I see it's not happening. And ultimately, if I had to ask myself, that's where it went wrong, because we don't have a financial market could fix this. That's what a capital market does. Now, if you look at the United States, the capital market doesn't always get these right, but it corrects errors. When we make ourselves dependent on Russia for gas, or put all our money into Volkswagen and Mercedes and BMW because these are great car companies, and if we get the technology wrong, then there's nothing that corrects it because we need then to wait for the next elections to get somebody else in who may not change it either because they're bound by some coalition agreements. This is not how you make the adjustments.
And what about, where does this leave the UK then? Am I right in thinking that you thought Brexit was a bad idea? Have you since changed your mind, or is your opinion now more
No,
nuanced?
no, I was always relatively neutral about this. I wasn't, I didn't campaign on either side. My sympathies were marginally in favor of Remain, but not on economic grounds, more on geopolitical grounds. I always thought it is possible for the UK to have an independent economic model, especially so since the single market is mostly about traded products, and the UK's strength is in traded services. So the UK was less dependent on the single market. I fear that the Brexit has had worse consequences for for the EU than for Britain, because it shifted majorities. It was only after Brexit that the EU became a lot more dirigiste in its policies. If you look at the way the Green Deal was carried out, the UK would not have approved of this, and I think there would have been different political majorities for at least some of the measures. The UK the UK has the chance to prosper without the EU if it doesn't repeat the same mistakes. The UK does have a capital market, unlike virtually all the EU countries, which is its advantage. It's a tragedy that the UK didn't stay in the EU and sort of became the EU, or became the kernel of a broader European capital market. That's a real tragedy, and that's basically, with the UK, the one sort of hope we had of a capital market kind of dissipated, since we're not undertaking any attempts to do this ourselves. The UK's chance of success or failure largely independent of the EU. The EU, I think at the moment it would probably be a mistake for the UK to align too closely with the EU, given that the EU has to kind of sort itself out before. And I would certainly not advise the UK to align with the EU on regulatory issues, for example, on IT regulation, where the EU has really gone very restrictive and very hostile. Unsurprisingly, there are no EU tech companies, because the regulatory impact regime is not ideal. The UK has some opportunities here to do it differently, and that would be sort of the sensible thing for the UK to do at the moment, while not still cooperate with the EU as much as possible. Certainly on geopolitical issues, it is absolutely essential that the EU and the UK cooperate. But I think the German economic crisis, will soon become an broader EU economic crisis, because they have their counterparts in a lot of EU legislation and the EU's regulatory approach. And I think the EU will have to sort itself out at some point, if it wants to sort of to remain a vibrant community of European states, in order to or else face much more sort of existential risks to its future.
And finally, Wolfgang, coming back to Germany, we ran a story yesterday about the state looking into or planning the construction of bomb shelters, and advising Germans to do the same in their homes. I mean, obviously, we're turning now to the Ukraine war. And to what extent does this loom over Germany's future?
Yeah, the war is a theme in the German election campaign. There's no doubt. I mean, the present government is treading, or the present chancellor is campaigning on the war, and he is campaigning in favor, really much against weapons deliveries. He is now, he's taken a more skeptical position than other heads of government in Europe. He is not. He refused to deliver the Taurus cruise missile system, which is what the current debate is all about, because Germany has this very potent medium range missile system that, if Ukraine were to have it, would allow the country to hit targets deep inside Russia. The Taurus would even reach Moscow. This would be, while that would probably not be a sensible usage of them, it is a possibility that that Germans were afraid of, and there's sort of a fear that this war might escalate with lots of threats from Russia. Germany is geographically much closer to Russia than the UK and France, and a lot more afraid that something might happen. I would therefore, say this is going to remain. Now, Friedrich Merz is more forthright. If he became chancellor, he may deliver these weapons. If these were still required, we may then be in a different phase. It will take time for another government to form. There may be no government in place until the summer. By the summer, it's quite possible that Trump and Putin will have come to some kind of deal, and that we will have moved into a different phase in this war. There might be an armistice or some kind of a ceasefire or some arrangement of a partition even of the country. And then we will have very different debates about who's going to pay for it and how do we police this and what is the future of this. So I wouldn't sort of necessarily extrapolate the debate, but Ukraine is sort of playing into the German election. There's a lot of fear in Germany, that's for sure, and certainly in East Germany. And I think that's where perspectives on Russia are also very different. The East Germans, I wouldn't say that they're pro-Russian, but they're certainly more sympathetic to Russia than in the West. They certainly know Russia better. Many older people still speak Russian. They are certainly more tuned to Russian arguments. And they're probably, East Germany, they always used to say this, the most Russian part of the whole of Eastern Europe. And it's going to be that, this is where the anti-Ukraine political parties, or the parties opposed to weapons deliveries and financial aid to Ukraine, have their stronghold, both on the right and the far left. That's in East Germany. And that's a factor in those elections. Not that these parties will win those elections, but that these parties will be strong enough to make it harder for others to form coalitions. And if you look at the arithmetic of German elections, it can probably will still change until the election date. But it is quite possible that the far right and the far left extremes together will occupy more than 1/3 of the seats of the parliament, which will make it hard for the parliament to, not only to change the constitution, because you need a 2/3 majority for this, but it will also make it hard for the government to even appoint judges. So you can see a significant disruptive influence from the far right and the far left, and they will and I expect their influence will increase over time. And as the country is not solving its economic problems, the number of people who are discontent and vote for protest parties, and these are these days more than just protest parties. These are parties that are they're interestingly, these extremist parties, they are another version of the 20th century, because none of them have any future direction. They all talk about, let's go back to the pipelines that gave us the Russian gas. Let's go back to steel and coal industries. They have very old-fashioned views of the economy, even more old-fashioned than the current parties, which is why I think this is so depressing. It's a contest between different versions of 20th century economics and 20th century industrial structures. It's not. Nobody's talking about the future because they all see themselves in their own. They're kind of locked in their own little world, in the way it used to be, the so-called good old times.
Right, a country that's living in the past. That's the impression I've got from you this morning. That's great. Wolfgang Münchau, many thanks for joining us online today.
Thank you for having me.
And thanks again for watching.